I have kept this record for 41 years. I have copied it by hand into 3 successive archive formats as the Convocation storage systems were upgraded. I have read it so many times that I can recite certain passages the way an elder recites a prayer, not because the words are beautiful, but because repetition is the only thing that keeps the mind from editing what it cannot accept. Today I am asked to speak it aloud. The chamber is the same chamber. The stone of the outer annex has not changed in the 280 years since the Orath Corridor designation was last reviewed. The delegates before me are younger than I expected, most of them born after the Thevari Convocation formally closed its outer reach transmission program, born into a galaxy that has simply always contained the sealed designation, the blank sector, the notation in the cartographic register that reads Orath Corridor human space overlap, no contact protocol in effect. They have grown up treating that notation as a settled fact rather than a conclusion reached through effort and loss and something else, something the archive records struggle to name, because the names available to bureaucratic record-keeping were not designed for this particular shape of encounter. That is, in some ways, what concerns me about this review. Not that the delegates are young, or that they are ambitious, or that they believe the designation should be reconsidered. All of that is understandable, even appropriate. What concerns me is that they may not know what they are asking to reconsider. I am Velith Soon. I have held the post of Senior Keeper of Outer Reach Transmission Records for the Thevari Convocation for 37 years. Before that, I served as Secondary Archivist under Coven Trath, who held the post for 52 years before me, and who was the one who handed me the physical storage cylinder containing the full Orath Corridor transmission record and said, without particular ceremony, that I should read it before I did anything else, and that I should read it alone. I read it alone. I finished it in 2 sittings spread over 3 days. On the 4th day, I went back to the archive floor and began the standard intake procedures for the new position, and I did not speak to Coven Trath about what I had read, and he did not ask. This is the custom of the post. It is not written down anywhere that I have found, but every keeper who has held this record has observed it in some form. You read the record, you sit with it until it has settled into a shape you can carry, and then you carry it without narrating it to people who have not read it. You become a kind of keeper in both senses of the word, keeper of the archive itself, and keeper of the particular kind of knowledge that cannot be usefully summarized. The knowledge that is made smaller by summarizing, not larger. I will say this much about my first reading. It changed nothing obvious. I did not emerge from the archive room with a different face. I did not make any unusual notations in the intake paperwork. I ate dinner that evening in the staff common room and discussed the weekend maintenance schedule for the outer reach filing system with 2 colleagues. What changed was internal and slow, and has not stopped changing in 37 years. The record is not a thing you read once and set down. It is a thing you read once and then continue reading for the rest of your professional life, in the sense that every new development you encounter, every new event in the outer reach, every diplomatic briefing and censor report and interspecies communique that crosses your desk, you read it against the Orath Corridor archive in the back of your mind, and you notice every time something does and does not fit. 37 years of that accumulates into something. I am not entirely sure what it accumulates into, but I am here today to offer it to you, and I will do the best I can. I have never discussed the contents with anyone who was not already bound to the archive by oath of office. I intend to honor that today, within the limits the Council has set for this hearing. Let me begin with what the Orath Corridor is, or rather, what it was before the designation was applied. It was a transit zone, a natural gap in the stellar density of the outer reach, a corridor of navigable space approximately 41 light-years wide at its narrowest point, running roughly tangential to what was, at the time of first survey, the outermost edge of confirmed human settlement. The Convocation's initial survey teams mapped it in the 4th century of the Thevari expansion, long before my tenure, long before Coven Traths, long before anyone now living held any position in this chamber. The survey designation was simple: a numbered transit corridor, priority class 3, recommended for future commercial routing pending diplomatic contact with the species whose settlement boundary ran along its eastern margin. That species was, of course, human. I want to be precise about what the record shows regarding the state of human-Thevari relations at the time of the initial mapping. There was no conflict. There had been no conflict. There had, in the strict sense, been no contact. The survey teams who mapped the Orath Corridor observed human-built infrastructure at distance, navigation beacons, what appeared to be long-range monitoring stations, and one structure of considerable size whose function was never determined, because the survey teams were under strict orders not to approach within 3 light towers of the corridor's eastern margin without a formal diplomatic clearance that had not yet been issued. They obeyed those orders. That fact is worth noting. The Thevari expansion in those decades was cautious by design. The Convocation had protocols for first contact with settled species, and they intended to follow them. The record of those early survey expeditions is one of the more quietly admirable portions of the archive. Careful people doing careful work, maintaining appropriate distance, filing thorough reports, waiting for the next step to be authorized. They knew they were looking at the edge of someone else's space, and they treated it as such. The structures along the eastern margin were logged in detail. Dimensions where visible material composition, where spectrometric analysis was possible, positional data to full precision. There were 47 distinct installations documented in the initial survey. When the survey team completed its work and returned to the Thevari space, the report concluded with a standard recommendation: Priority 3 designation for commercial routing, pending first contact clearance, with a note that the human infrastructure along the eastern margin appeared well established, and that contact protocols should assume an advanced and settled species with a long presence in this region. That note turned out to be understated in ways the survey team could not have known. The first formal transmission into the Orath Corridor was sent in the 412th year of the expansion. It was, by every standard of the time, a careful document. I have read it many times. It is courteous, measured, appropriately deferential to the possibility that human protocols for receiving contact from unknown species might differ substantially from our own. It introduces the Convocation, outlines its purpose, acknowledges that the Orath Corridor sits adjacent to established human space, and requests a response at whatever interval is convenient for the receiving party. It was transmitted on 17 frequencies simultaneously, including 3 that the survey teams had noted appeared to be in regular use along the eastern margin's beacon network. Proof of receipt was not requested, but the transmission protocols of the time included an automatic read confirmation pulse, a technical feature of the communication system, not a demand, simply a quiet electronic acknowledgement that the signal had been received and decoded. The read confirmation pulse came back within 6 hours. The humans had received the transmission. The decoding confirmed it had been processed, not merely buffered. The signal had been read. No reply came. The Convocation waited 1 full standard year. This was not impatience. It was the outer limit specified in their own contact protocols for a species whose response timeline was unknown. When no reply had arrived at the 1-year mark, they sent a second transmission. This one was slightly shorter, slightly more direct. It referenced the first transmission, acknowledged the possibility that customs around reply protocols might differ, and suggested that even a brief acknowledgement of receipt would be welcomed, so that the Convocation could calibrate its expectations appropriately. The read confirmation pulse returned within 4 hours. No reply came. I want the council to sit with that for a moment. Not the silence. The silence is the part everyone focuses on, and I understand why. But I want you to sit with the read confirmation pulse. The humans were not failing to receive the transmissions. They were not lost or absent or operating in a communication blackout. They received every transmission. They decoded every transmission. And they chose, with full information and full awareness of what was being sent, not to reply. This went on for 114 years. 57 transmissions over 114 years. Each one formally logged, each one confirmed received by the automatic pulse system, each one met with silence. The convocation's approach evolved considerably over that time. The early transmissions had been cautious and deferential. By the third decade, with no response forthcoming, they had added formal diplomatic identifiers and a request for any preferred communication protocol that humans might wish the convocation to adopt. By the fifth decade, the transmissions had been translated into 12 different structural formats on the theory that perhaps the issue was linguistic or cultural rather than deliberate, that perhaps human communication norms made the Thevari's epistolary style unreadable in some fundamental way. The read confirmation pulses came back each time. The transmissions were being read. They were simply not being answered. I have had many years to think about what that must have felt like from inside the convocation at the time. The records of the internal deliberations from that period are preserved, and I have read them. There is a quality to the language that I find difficult to describe, a growing frustration that manages to remain always, technically, within the bounds of diplomatic patience. You can hear people in those records trying very hard to believe that the silence was an accident, or a misunderstanding, or the result of some internal political complexity on the human side that made formal reply impossible. You can hear them reasoning their way through each possible innocent explanation and finding, each time, that the explanations did not quite fit the evidence. Because the evidence was the read confirmation pulse, the transmissions were being read. The simplest explanation that the humans had read the transmissions, understood them, and simply had nothing they wished to say in return, was available from the very beginning. The convocation did not adopt it for nearly 40 years, and I think that is understandable. It is a difficult thing to accept, that a species with the capability to respond has simply declined to do so. It implies a level of disinterest, or a level of preoccupation with something else entirely. That sits uncomfortably with the assumption that first contact between spacefaring species is inherently significant to both parties. The humans, apparently, did not share that assumption. Or they did, and first contact with the Thevari Convocation simply did not meet their threshold for significance. I have thought about this particular possibility more than any other in the 41 years I have kept this record, not because it is the most frightening, though it is, I think, the most frightening if you let yourself understand what it implies, but because it is the one the archive most consistently points toward without ever quite naming. The convocation sent 57 transmissions over 114 years. They were all received. They were all read. And whatever the humans were doing during those 114 years, it apparently did not include thinking that any of those transmissions required a response. Their attention was elsewhere. Elsewhere in the way that the attention of someone who is very busy with something very large is elsewhere. Not inattentive. Just calibrated to a different scale. In the 67th year after the first transmission, the convocation made a decision that I consider, with the benefit of the full record, to have been understandable and probably mistaken. They sent a transmission that was not a diplomatic introduction. It was not a request for a preferred communication protocol. It was a formal statement of intent to use the Orath Corridor as a commercial transit route, with a proposed timeline, a description of the traffic volume expected, and a request for acknowledgement of any human navigational restrictions or exclusion zones that the Convocation's vessels should observe. The reasoning was sound, in a narrow way. The Convocation had been waiting for contact for 67 years. The Orath Corridor was genuinely valuable transit space. Other species in the outer reach were beginning to ask why it remained unused. The decision was made that unilateral use of the corridor, with appropriate notification, was a reasonable step, and that announcing that step clearly and formally was the respectful approach. The document was carefully worded. The Convocation's legal bureau reviewed it. It was not aggressive, not threatening, not an assertion of territorial claim. It was a navigational notification, the kind of thing that spacefaring species exchange routinely. The read confirmation pulse came back within 2 hours, faster than usual. No reply came, but something else did. 3 days after the transmission was sent, one of the long-range monitoring buoys that the Convocation maintained at the edge of the survey zone, a passive instrument, not transmitting, simply recording, logged a change in the sensor profile of the Orath Corridor's eastern margin. It logged it automatically, as it was designed to do, and the log was filed in the standard data stream that flowed back to the Convocation's Outer Reach Analysis Bureau. An analyst named Orath Corridor found the log 11 days after it was filed. She is in the record. I know her name because she wrote a formal memorandum about what she had found, and that memorandum is preserved, and it is one of the most precisely worded documents in the entire Orath archive. She was, from everything I can reconstruct about her from the record, an exceptionally careful person. Her other memoranda from that period are also in the archive: routine analyses, sensor calibration reports, standard outer reach monitoring summaries. They are all written with the same care. She was not someone who alarmed easily or who reached for dramatic interpretations. This makes her Orath Corridor memorandum more significant, not less. What she had found was this: the sensor profile of the eastern margin had changed because there were now significantly more structures along it than there had been before the transmission was sent. She was careful in her memorandum. She noted that the monitoring buoy's data resolution was limited, that the new readings could represent a number of things: natural formations, automated infrastructure expansion, the normal growth pattern of an active settlement, and that she did not want to overstate what the data showed. She noted that she had compared the new sensor profile to the most recent previous scan, which was 11 months old, and that the change was substantial. She put a number on it. The sensor return volume from the eastern margin was 40 to 60% higher than the previous scan, within the instrument's margin of error. She noted that she was flagging this for senior review. She also noted, in the final paragraph, that the timing was probably coincidental, and she did not want to imply otherwise. I have read that paragraph many times. I think Orath Corridor was a careful and honest person who was trying very hard not to imply something she could not prove, but that she had already concluded. The timing was 3 days. 3 days between the Convocation's transmission of intent to use the corridor and a 40 to 60% increase in human infrastructure along the margin that would have required a substantial logistical commitment to execute at any speed. 3 days is not enough time, by any conventional measure, to move and establish a 40 to 60% expansion of border infrastructure. It is barely enough time to issue the orders. Whatever the expanded sensor profile represented, it had not been built in response to the transmission. It had been there, or in preparation, before the transmission arrived, and the timing of its appearance in the monitoring data 3 days after the transmission suggested that whatever triggered the buoy's logging was not the construction itself but something else. A change in the margin signature, an adjustment. The Convocation's Senior Analysis Bureau reviewed her memorandum. They agreed that the timing was probably coincidental. They agreed that the data resolution was limited. They agreed that the change in sensor profile warranted continued monitoring, but did not, in itself, constitute evidence of anything that should alter the Convocation's approach. Here I want to pause for a moment and acknowledge what I see in the faces of some of the delegates before me. You are younger than this record. You have spent your professional lives in a convocation that has a sophisticated and hard-won understanding of the outer reach, of the species that inhabit it, the geopolitical pressures that shape it, the ways that ambiguous sensor data can be misread and mishandled to everyone's detriment. You have been trained, appropriately, to be skeptical of escalation, skeptical of pattern matching that isn't supported by the data, skeptical of the kind of institutional fear that causes organizations to make poor decisions in the name of caution. I was trained the same way. These are good instincts. I want you to understand that I share them, and that I am not standing before you as someone who abandoned them. I am standing before you as someone who read the archive with those instincts fully intact and arrived anyway at the conclusion I have arrived at. The Senior Analysis Bureau's response to Orath Carroll's memorandum was not wrong by the standards they were working with. The data was ambiguous. The timing was technically, mathematically, within the range of coincidence. Their decision to continue monitoring and not escalate was defensible. It was also the decision that would be made again in one form or another at nearly every significant juncture in this record. And I have thought many times about what that pattern means. Not incompetence, not cowardice. Something more structural than either. A set of institutional reflexes that were designed for a galaxy of a certain kind, encountering something that did not fit that kind, and defaulting each time to the most conservative available interpretation, because that is what the protocols prescribed. The humans, from the other side of whatever they are on the other side of, watched this happen for 164 years. They did not send a transmission into the Orath Corridor for the next 8 years. I do not know whether this pause was deliberate or simply the result of internal reorganization in the Diplomatic Bureau. There was a change of leadership in that period, and the Orath file was transferred between offices 3 times. What I know is that for 8 years no transmission was sent, and then one was, and the read confirmation pulse came back within 3 hours, and no reply came. The commercial transit proposal was not raised again. The transmissions that followed over the next 3 decades returned to the earlier diplomatic register, careful, deferential, measured. They continued to be received and not answered. By the 102nd year, the convocation's internal records show less and less deliberation about each transmission. They had become almost routine. Someone in the Diplomatic Bureau drafted a new one each decade, someone senior reviewed it. It was sent on the standard 17 frequency protocol. The pulse came back. The file was updated. No one expected a reply. They had stopped expecting a reply some decades before. But the transmissions continued because stopping them would have required a decision. And decisions about the Orath Corridor had become difficult things inside the convocation, weighted with too much accumulated uncertainty, too many unresolved readings, too many moments that were probably coincidental. It was in the 141st year that the second significant event occurred. A convocation exploration vessel, the Seventh Margin Classification, a mid-range scientific survey ship, crew of 43, filed a standard course plan that took it to within 9 light hours of the Orath Corridor's eastern margin. Not into the corridor itself, not approaching any known human installation, simply transiting through outer reach space in the general region, conducting a survey of a stellar formation that had no particular relationship to human space. The ship's name in the record is the Orath Carroll. Someone in the Survey Bureau had named it after the analyst. I find that detail meaningful, though I could not say exactly why. Perhaps it was a formal honor for a careful professional. Perhaps it was something more specific, an acknowledgement by someone who had read her memorandum closely, that she had seen something real in the sensor data and that the institution had not properly credited her for it. I do not know. The naming is not explained in any document I have found. It is simply there, the ship named Orath Corridor, carrying 43 people into the outer reach. The ship completed the first half of its survey without incident. On the 31st day of its mission, its communication officer logged a contact, not a transmission, not a signal of the diplomatic variety, but a navigational handshake. The kind of automated exchange that happens when two vessel systems recognize each other's presence in a shared region of space. A functional exchange, the equivalent of two ships in a harbor noting each other's position. It happens constantly in settled space and is generally logged and forgotten. The communication officer logged it because the other vessel's identifier did not match any convocation registry. It did not match any registry the Orath Corridor system had access to at all. The exchange had lasted 0.3 seconds. In that time, the other vessel's system had transmitted a standard navigational identifier and received one in return. That was all. No communication, no approach, no contact in any meaningful sense. The other vessel was present in the region, noted the Orath Corridor, exchanged navigational data as any responsible spacefaring vessel does, and continued on its way. The communication officer noted that the other vessel's identifier, while unfamiliar, had followed the correct protocol for the exchange with complete technical precision. Whatever the vessel was, it knew how to do this. It had done it correctly, efficiently, and without any indication that the Orath Corridor's presence was unexpected or remarkable. The other vessel did not appear again in the Orath Corridor's sensor logs. It had been there in the navigational exchange, and then it had not been there. The Orath Corridor completed its survey and returned to the Thevari space. Its communication officer filed a full incident report. The incident report went to the Outreach Analysis Bureau. A senior analyst reviewed it and noted that the unregistered vessel's identifier, while not in any convocation registry, had a structural format that matched certain documented examples of human navigational coding, not definitively, but plausibly. He noted also that the other vessel's approach and departure from the Orath Corridor's sensor range had been entirely unremarkable. No unusual acceleration, no anomalous spatial signatures, no behavior that would have drawn attention if the identifier had been familiar. A normal vessel, behaving normally, 9 light hours from the eastern margin of the Orath Corridor. In a region of space, the convocation had considered essentially empty. The report was classified at the restricted level and filed in the Orath archive. It was not sent back to the Survey Bureau. It was not distributed to the Diplomatic Bureau. It was classified, filed, and for 22 years, not referenced in any subsequent document that I have been able to locate. I want to be honest with this council about what that classification represents. I do not believe it represents a cover-up in any malicious sense. I believe it represents exactly what it looks like. A decision by someone in the archive system that the information was too ambiguous to be useful and too sensitive to be distributed, and that the correct response was to hold it until there was more context. It is the kind of decision that institutional record keepers make constantly, usually correctly, when they receive information that is difficult to categorize. You hold it. You wait for the thing that will tell you what it means. There was never more context. There was the file sealed for 22 years. In the 163rd year, the convocation sent a transmission that was different in character from all the preceding ones. The Diplomatic Bureau had, by that point, undergone 4 complete leadership changes. The personnel who had made the decision not to raise the commercial transit proposal again were long retired. The personnel who had classified the Orath Corridor incident report were long retired. The file was there in the archive, but it required specific search terms and a restricted access clearance to find it, and the new Diplomatic Bureau leadership had neither the specific search terms nor the particular reason to go looking. What the new leadership had was a mandate to resolve open outer reach designations. The Orath Corridor appeared on their list as an unresolved first contact situation, 163 years old, with no documented reason for the lack of progress. The classification notation on the archive file was visible. They knew there was restricted material, but the substance of it was not accessible to them, and their mandate was to move forward. The transmission they sent was formal and confident. It introduced the convocation with the authority of 163 years of accumulated status in the outer reach. It described the Orath Corridor in terms of mutual commercial benefit. It noted, without dwelling on it, that the convocation had been attempting to establish contact for an extended period, and that it hoped this transmission would receive a response. And it stated, clearly and without apology, that if no response was received within 2 standard years, the convocation would proceed with the corridor's formal reclassification as an open transit zone. The read confirmation pulse came back within 40 minutes. I want to note the interval. Previous transmissions had received pulses in 2 to 6 hours, occasionally faster in the later ones. 40 minutes meant something that I think the diplomatic bureau chose not to examine. A signal sent to the eastern margin of the Orath Corridor and processed within 40 minutes implied either an automated system operating at exceptional speed or a receiver that was very close, much closer than any logged human installation had ever been surveyed. The diplomatic bureau's records from this period note the interval and mark it as a calibration point for future transmissions. They do not analyze it further. I think this is because analyzing it would have required acknowledging what it implied, and acknowledging what it implied would have made the reclassification mandate significantly harder to pursue. No reply came in the first week. No reply came in the first month. In the third month, a border monitoring station in the outer reach, a Thevari installation, staffed, positioned well outside the Orath Corridor itself, filed a routine maintenance report that included a note from its senior technician. The note stated that the station's long-range passive array had detected, over the preceding 6 weeks, what appeared to be movement in the Orath Corridor's central region, at a depth significantly beyond the eastern margin, deeper into the corridor than any previous sensor reading had shown anything. The technician noted that the readings were faint, at the edge of the instrument's reliable range, and that she was not prepared to characterize what she was seeing. She logged the note as an instrument anomaly, pending review. The maintenance report went to the Technical Bureau. The note about the corridor readings was flagged to the Outer Reach Analysis Bureau. The Outer Reach Analysis Bureau sent a query to the Orath Archive, requesting a summary of prior sensor anomalies from the corridor region. This is how the Orath Corridor incident report was found. A junior archivist running the query surfaced the classified file, noted its classification, and escalated to a senior analyst, who escalated to the archive director, who escalated to the convocation's senior counsel. I am not going to pretend this escalation happened efficiently. It took 11 months. 11 months during which the border monitoring station continued to file maintenance reports with identical notes about faint movement readings in the corridor's central region. 11 months during which the diplomatic bureau's 2-year deadline continued to run. 11 months during which, somewhere in the corridor's central depths, something was moving faintly, at the edge of instruments designed to detect precisely this kind of thing, consistently enough that the senior technician filed the same note in 3 consecutive maintenance reports before anyone in a position to act on it had been told what the archive contained. When the archive director finally sat before the senior counsel and described the contents of the Orath Corridor file, the navigational handshake, the unregistered vessel, the plausible structural match to human coding, and connected it to the corridor's new sensor readings, the senior counsel did what senior counsels generally do when confronted with information they cannot immediately process. They formed a committee. The committee's task was to determine, within 90 days, whether the convocation should continue to the planned reclassification of the Orath Corridor as an open transit zone, or whether the accumulated evidence warranted a revision of approach. The committee met 7 times. I have their meeting records. The deliberations are detailed and serious, and the people in those rooms were genuinely trying to think carefully about what they knew and what they did not know. I will not walk through all of them. I will say only that by the 6th meeting, a majority of the committee had concluded that the accumulated evidence, the accelerated read confirmation intervals, the Orath Corridor's navigational handshake, the border station's ongoing movement readings, suggested a human presence in the Orath Corridor that was more extensive and more active than any prior survey had indicated. The corridor had not been empty. It had never been empty. The humans had been there in the corridor, not merely along the margin, at least since the Orath Corridor's survey, and possibly since the beginning. The question the committee faced in its 7th meeting was whether this changed the calculus of the reclassification. Whether the evidence of an active human presence meant the convocation should accelerate its contact efforts or abandon them. There were voices on both sides. I have read the transcripts carefully. The voices arguing for acceleration were not foolish. They pointed out accurately that the evidence showed a human presence without showing any hostile action, that the navigational handshake had been carried out correctly and politely, that there was no reason to interpret presence as threat. These were reasonable observations, and I do not dismiss them. The voices arguing for a different approach were fewer in number, and had more difficulty articulating what they were responding to. The instinct was there in the room, you can feel it in the transcript, but it did not have clean language to work with. What they were responding to was not a threat. It was the accumulated weight of 163 years of transmissions, received and read and not answered, and now a human vessel operating 9 light towers from the margin, and movement readings at the corridor's center, and a read confirmation pulse returning in 40 minutes. Not a threat. A presence that had always been there, larger and more settled and more patient than anything the convocation had anticipated, which had watched 163 years of diplomatic attempts with what? With what, exactly? The transcripts do not find the word because there was no good word available for it. Equanimity, perhaps. A species observing something it found neither threatening nor urgent. From a distance, it considered entirely comfortable. The committee's chair was a council elder named Thevari. I know his name because he signed the final recommendation document that came out of that 7th meeting, and because I have read his personal notes from the deliberations, which are preserved in the archive alongside the official records. His personal notes are sparse. He was not a man who wrote more than he needed to, but there is one entry from the day before the 7th meeting that I find I return to often. It reads, "If they have been there all along, and they have read every word we sent, and they have chosen not to reply, then the question is not whether we should contact them. The question is whether we understand what silence means." The committee's recommendation, signed by Thevari, was to delay the reclassification by 1 year and send one final transmission, not a diplomatic introduction, not a commercial proposal, but a direct question. One transmission, one question. Why have you not responded? I think Thevari believed the question might finally get an answer. I think he believed that directness, after 163 years of diplomatic circumlocution, might do what no amount of courtesy had managed. He was right that it would get an answer. He was not right about what the answer would mean. The transmission was sent in the 164th year. One question, formatted in the 17-frequency standard protocol, translated into every structural format the convocation had ever used for the Orath transmissions, addressed specifically to the human presence in the corridor rather than to any general designation. The read confirmation pulse came back in 11 minutes. The reply came back in 12. I have to stop here for a moment and describe what that means, because I think some of you may not understand the significance of the interval. 11 minutes for the read confirmation pulse. 1 additional minute for the reply. The corridor's central region, where the movement readings had been logged, was at minimum 41 light hours from any monitoring position the convocation maintained. A signal traveling at standard transmission speed could not cross that distance in 11 minutes. It is not physically possible. A read confirmation pulse returning in 11 minutes from a position 41 light hours away would require the signal to travel at a factor of something approaching 220 times the standard transmission speed. The communication systems analysts in the archive have reviewed this figure many times over the past 280 years. They have reviewed the transmission logs, the timing records, the calibration data for the communication equipment. The 11-minute interval is accurate. The equipment was functioning correctly. The implications of the interval are what they are. I am not going to speculate about what those implications mean for our understanding of human technological capability. I am telling you what the record shows. The reply was received. It was decoded in the standard formats. It was translated by the convocation's language systems. It was coherent. It was, in the technical sense of the word, an answer to the question that had been asked. The question was, why have you not responded? The reply was 47 words in the translation. I have memorized them, though I have never spoken them aloud outside of the archive, and I will not speak them in full today. What I will tell you is the substance, because the Council has asked me to characterize the reply's content, and I will answer that question honestly. The reply said, in substance, that the convocation's transmissions had been received. It confirmed that they had been read. It stated that the humans had discussed them at whatever level of attention each had warranted. And then it said something that I have spent 41 years trying to fully understand, and that I am still not certain I have rendered correctly. It said that the convocation's transmissions had not been answered because, from the human perspective, answering them would have been premature. That the convocation had been asking in various ways for over 160 years for permission to use the corridor or for acknowledgement of human presence there, and that those requests were being declined, not because the humans objected to the convocation, not because there was any hostility, but because the convocation had not yet arrived at the correct question. The reply said that when the convocation arrived at the correct question, they would recognize it. And then it said one more thing, one more sentence, which I will not read directly but which I will characterize as accurately as I can. It said that the convocation should be aware that the Orath Corridor was not a transit zone. It was a threshold. And that the humans were content for the Thevari to remain on the side of the threshold where they currently were, and that they extended this as a courtesy, not a warning. Not a warning. I want to sit with that with you for a moment, the way I have sat with it for 41 years. They extended it as a courtesy, not a warning. The distinction they drew, and they drew it explicitly, in a 47-word reply to a question we had waited 164 years to ask, was between a warning, which implies that the party being warned might be in a position to have a choice about the matter, and a courtesy, which implies something more like, we are telling you this because it is considerate to tell you, not because your subsequent behavior is expected to make any meaningful difference to the outcome. The senior counsel received the translated reply within 4 hours of its transmission. Sethan Voreth read it. I have his personal notes from that day. The entry is short. It reads, I had the wrong question. The correct question is not why they did not respond. The correct question is what they were waiting for us to understand before responding. We have not understood it yet. Below that, in smaller characters, he wrote, I do not think we are ready to understand it yet. The Convocation's senior counsel met that same evening. The meeting was closed. The transcript is in the archive and I have read it, and I am not at liberty to reproduce it for this council today because it remains classified at the highest level the Convocation's record system permits. What I am at liberty to tell you is the outcome. The Council voted to close the Orath Corridor transmission program. Not to suspend it, not to delay it further, to close it. To formally designate the Orath Corridor as a no-contact sector under the Convocation's outer reach protocols, with a review threshold set at 250 years, with the full archive classified at the restricted level, and with a notation in the cartographic register that read, ORATH Corridor, Human Space Overlap, No Contact Protocol in effect. That notation is what you see today. It has not been changed. It has outlasted Thevari Convocation, who died 22 years after the vote. It has outlasted Coven Trath, who was a junior archivist during the vote and spent 52 years as senior keeper of the record before handing it to me. It has been there for 280 years. The 250-year review threshold was reached 30 years ago. This hearing is the result. You are the review. I want to be clear about what I am recommending and why. There are arguments for reopening contact. I have heard them over the years, and I have heard some of them again in the preparation documents for this hearing. The Orath Corridor remains a valuable transit zone by any commercial or navigational measure. The reply the Convocation received 280 years ago was not hostile. The humans expressed no objection to the Thevari in particular. The 280-year closure was based on the judgment of a council that is long gone, about a reply that was arguably ambiguous, in a context that has substantially changed. There is a reasonable case to be made that the decision to close was overcautious, and that a new generation of careful, respectful diplomatic contact might be received differently. I want to tell you why I do not believe these arguments are wrong so much as they are incomplete. The reply took 12 minutes from the point the transmission was received to the point it arrived at our monitoring equipment. The read confirmation pulse took 11 minutes to return from a source that, by every measurement the Convocation's communication systems could make, should have required more than 2 days to reach and return from at standard transmission rates. I have thought about this for 41 years, and I do not have an explanation that does not involve human technological capability that is categorically different from anything we have encountered elsewhere in the outer reach, or indeed anywhere in the surveyed galaxy. I am not a physicist. I am not a communication engineer. I am a record keeper. What I can tell you is that the record shows 11 minutes. I cannot tell you what it means, only that it means something. The reply said the corridor was a threshold. In 47 words of response to 164 years of transmission, the humans chose to use the word threshold. Not border, not territory, not restricted zone, threshold. A threshold is something you stand before. It is something you cross only when you are ready. It carries, in almost every language the Convocation's translation systems work with, a connotation not of exclusion but of readiness. The question is not whether you are permitted, but whether you are prepared. Thevari Convocation wrote, the night after the reply arrived, that we had not understood yet what we needed to understand. He did not say what that was. I think he had a sense of it, and I think he was honest enough not to write it down because he could not be certain, and he was a careful man. I have a sense of it too, after 41 years, and I am going to say it here because this council asked me to speak plainly. I do not think the humans were annoyed by the transmissions. I do not think they found them intrusive or aggressive or threatening. I think they found them, and I am choosing this word carefully, insufficient. Not diplomatically insufficient, not technically insufficient. Insufficient in some way that we don't have a category for yet. They waited 164 years for us to ask the right question. When we finally asked something sufficiently direct, they answered within 12 minutes. They had been ready to answer for 164 years. We hadn't been ready to ask. And what they told us when we finally asked was that we were standing before a threshold and that they were content to let us stand there. Content, not impatient, not watchful in the way that a guard watches. content in the way that a settled population is content to let the world outside continue at its own pace. The word content, as the translation system rendered it, carried an additional connotation that the translators flagged in their notes, an implication of duration. Not content in this moment, but content across a span of time that the translation system's notes describe as difficult to calibrate without more examples of human temporal reference. A contentment that was not new. A contentment that had been in place for a while. How long a while, the translators could not say. They noted only that the temporal connotation was deep and that they were uncertain whether our language had a good equivalent for it. I have tried to imagine what 164 years of transmissions looks like from inside that kind of patience. I have tried to imagine receiving careful diplomatic introductions, proposals for commercial transit routes, formal statements of intent, decade after decade, from a species that believes it is working toward contact, but has not yet understood what contact actually requires. I can only imagine it the way you imagine standing very still at the edge of a deep place, watching something in the water below you, and waiting to see whether the thing in the water will eventually understand that it is being watched, and what it does when it realizes. I do not know what the convocation would need to become in order to ask the right question. I do not know what threshold means in the way the humans intended it. I know that after 41 years with this record, and after speaking these words aloud today for the first time, I am more certain than I have ever been about one thing. We are not ready. We were not ready 280 years ago. I do not believe we are ready now. And I think, and this is the part that is hardest to say, the part I have been turning over for 4 decades, I think the humans know we are not ready, and I think they are not troubled by it, and I think that is the most significant thing in this entire record. They are not waiting for us to become ready in the way you wait for something you need. They are simply there, on the other side of the threshold, content. There is a word in the old Thevari navigational language. It has no modern administrative equivalent, but it exists in the archive's linguistic records, for the notation that cartographers used to make at the edge of surveyed space. Not a boundary marker, not a forbidden zone, not a warning, something quieter. It translates approximately as, beyond this point the map does not apply. I believe the Orath Corridor designation should be maintained. I believe the sector should remain designated as human space overlap, no contact protocol in effect, and I believe the review threshold should be extended. Not because the humans are dangerous in any conventional sense. The record does not show danger. It shows patience, and patience of a quality that makes danger seem almost too small a word for what it implies. But because we have not yet arrived at the question they were waiting for us to ask, and sending more transmissions before we have found that question is not contact. It is noise. They told us when we finally asked something real, we will let you stand here as long as you need to. It is a courtesy. One of the delegates, the third from the left in the second tier, whose name I was given in the briefing documents but whose name I will not use here, raised a question during my testimony that I want to address directly, because I heard it in the way a question is sometimes asked when the person asking already suspects the answer but wants to see whether the person answering will say it. The question was, what do you believe the humans want from us? I thought about this for a long moment before answering, and I thought about it again last night before coming here, and I have thought about it a third time since the question was asked. My answer is the same each time. I do not believe the humans want anything from us. I believe that is the part of the record that every generation of convocation leadership has found hardest to sit with, because we are a species, as most spacefaring species are, that thinks in terms of exchange, of want and offer, of need and provision, of the negotiation between parties who each have something the other lacks. Every diplomatic framework we have built assumes this structure. The parties want things. The resolution is finding what each party's wants are, and whether they can be satisfied in a way both parties can accept. The Orath Corridor archive contains 164 years of transmission structured on this assumption. The humans want something, and we must find out what it is and offer something for it, so that we may have access to the corridor. This assumption runs through every document the diplomatic bureau produced in that period. It is so fundamental to the framework that it is never stated explicitly, because it did not need to be stated. It was the only framework the bureau had. The 47 words in the reply do not fit this framework. They are not the response of a party negotiating from a position of strength. They are not the response of a party with conditions to offer or demands to make. They are the response of something that is simply present and settled, and has no particular need for anything the convocation might provide, and is not in a hurry, and is willing to wait for the Thevari to find on their own whatever it is they need to find. This is a genuinely difficult thing for a diplomatic institution to process, because there is no diplomatic procedure for it. There is no protocol that covers the situation in which the other party does not want anything. Every protocol assumes a want. The reply removed the want and left us with the threshold, and the courtesy, and the silence. I am tendering my resignation from the post of senior keeper today, effective upon the conclusion of this hearing. I am doing this not as a protest, and not because I am unable to continue. I am doing it because I have said everything I know how to say about this record, and I have said it today, and someone younger should carry it now, someone who may, in another 40 years, find the question that I never found. The post does not retire when I do. The archive will be here. The corridor designation will be here. The 47 words of the reply will be there in their classified file, unread by anyone who has not taken the oath, patient as everything in this record has been patient, waiting for whoever sits in my chair next to be ready for them. I ask this council to vote to maintain the designation. I ask it knowing that some of you will find my account insufficient, or overcautious, or shaped by 40 years of proximity to a record that I am perhaps too close to read clearly. That is a fair criticism. I cannot step outside my own 40 years. What I can tell you is this: the humans have not changed the notation in the cartographic register. The corridor remains what they called it. A threshold, and on their side of it, 280 years after we last transmitted, they are content. That is the record. That is my testimony. The file is sealed, and it has told us everything it is able to tell, and we have understood perhaps a third of it. I will not speak of the contents of the reply again. The council voted 3 hours after I left the chamber. I was not present for the vote and did not ask to be. The result was communicated to me by the duty archivist, who knocked on the door of the Outerreach record room where I had been sitting since my testimony ended, not reading anything, simply sitting in the room where I have spent 37 years, in the particular quality of quiet that old archive rooms have, the quiet of things that have been kept carefully for a very long time. The vote was to maintain the designation. The Orath Corridor remains designated as human space overlap, no contact protocol in effect, review threshold extended by a further 200 years. The notation in the cartographic register stands unchanged. I submitted my resignation papers that evening. The next morning I began the transfer inventory, the formal documentation of every file in the Orath archive, so that whoever comes next will know what they are inheriting in full. It is a significant quantity of material. It will take some weeks to properly inventory. I find I do not mind the time it requires. I think of Orath Carroll sometimes when I am working through the inventory. Her memorandum is there in the file with its final paragraph about coincidence. I think about what she saw in the data that she was careful enough not to say, and I think about the ship that carries her name, transiting the outer reach on some survey course 41 years after her memorandum, noting the navigational handshake, filing the report. The ship is still registered. I checked, out of a habit I do not entirely understand. It is still in the survey fleet's active manifest, assigned to outer-reach work, flying the edges of the mapped galaxy the way it always has. I do not know whether the humans know the ship is named for her. I do not know whether they would find it meaningful, or unremarkable, or something else for which I do not have a word. The record does not cover everything. It covers what was transmitted, what was received, what was replied. It does not cover what was understood. That is the gap I have been working at for 37 years, and it is the gap I am leaving for whoever comes next. Coven Trath worked at it for 52 years and did not close it. I worked at it for 37 and did not close it. The keeper before Coven Trath worked at it for 29 years. The record is older than the three of us combined. Whatever the gap requires in order to close, it requires something that has not yet been brought to it. I believe it will be brought to it, eventually, by someone, by some generation of the Thevari who have grown into a different kind of question. I cannot say when. I cannot say what they will have to have become. I can only say that the record will be waiting, exactly as it has always waited, and that the humans on the other side of the threshold will also be waiting, with a patience that 280 years has not diminished by any measurable amount. Stand at the threshold long enough and you learn to stop asking when you may cross. That is not wisdom. That is the beginning of it.